Dakle, dobrodošli na današnji masterclass, specijalno predavanje Anouchke Grose, koja će nam danas govoriti o psihoanalizi i eko-anksioznosti. Kao što ste vidjeli u pozivu za ovo specijalno predavanje, Anouchka Grose je psihoanalitičarka i spisateljica bazirana u Londonu, a članica je Centra za freudijanska istraživanja gdje redovno predaje. Objavljivala je književnu i publicističku prozu, a najnovija knjiga je Guide to Eko-anksioznosti, How to Protect the Planet and Your Mental Health. Također piše o umjetnosti i modi, aktivna je kao saradnica časopisa The Guardian i radio postaja Radio 4 i Resonance FM. A što se tiče današnjeg specijalnog predavanja, glavna pitanja o kojima će Anouchka govoriti su kako treba da ozbiljno shvatimo klimatsku krizu bez da se predajemo depresiji, anksioznosti i preventivnom žalovanju, i kako psihoanalitičari treba da odgovore na patnje svojih klijenata i izazvane klimatom i klimatskim problemima. Tako da ti Tretmani eko-anksioznosti uglavnom prate okvirni obrazac koji glasi: meditirajte, razgovarajte s prijateljima i uključite se u aktivizam. Sada, to je citat koja Anouchka navodi, a mada su sve ovo sasvim adekvatne ideje, one ponekad tek površno dotiču se pitanja psihičke boli izazvane gubitkom specije, globalnim otopljavanjem i prijetnjom društvenog sloma, a da ne spominjemo ideju da naša planeta nije više održiv habitat za novi život. Tako da će ovo predavanje razmatrati načine na koje klimatska kriza može utjecati na naše mentalno zdravlje, kao i ponuditi neka alternativna razmišljanja o tome kako psihoanalitičari mogu pristupiti i odgovoriti na eko-anksioznost, temeljeći se na idejama eko-psihoanalize s ciljem da ponudi jednu vrstu psihoaktivizma, što je vrlo važan i interesantan termin. Ne termin, nego problem i nešto što me zaista interesuje, ali prije svega toga, let us give the floor to Anouchka Grose. Welcome again, Anouchka, and we're very happy that you're with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's yeah, so I'll try and introduce the talk a little bit. Just say it's going to be in two parts. So at the beginning I'll talk more generally about eco-anxiety and some of the ways it manifests in the clinic, and a few psychoanalytic ideas about it. And then in the second part, I'd like to talk about, it's the main theme we see clinically in a way. There's suffering, or anxiety around climate change, but then there's this idea which isn't always presented as a form of suffering, but that of people in their 20s and 30s in analysis just so often say that there's no way they would ever have a child because there's, it's just completely unsafe planet to bring a child into. And also the child would further damage the unsafe planet. So this sort of, I don't know, almost everyone in that age bracket seems to be of the same opinion that having children is just somehow not possible or not acceptable. And so, yeah, just wanted to talk a bit about that, how we might think about it and work with it. So, and I got into all this stuff in a way a really long time ago in the 80s, where just by going vegetarian, and then I wrote a book for vegetarians just about sort of why a person might stop eating meat, and so it was to try and pull it away from the idea that you wouldn't eat meat because you were so soppy and you love animals so much, but because of things like third world debt that might be I don't know, used to extract corn, cattle feed, to feed American cattle, or because of deforestation in Brazil, or all these things, and try and explain that stuff to teenagers. and so I've been kind of working in that field ever since a bit. And in the meantime, I became a psychoanalyst, and I guess that has sort of brought a different aspect to that discourse. And I kind of got really back into it after I wrote an article for a British newspaper about a thing called the Greenlandic Perspective Survey, which came out in 2019. And it was a study of how climate change was affecting people in Greenland. And the reason they chose Greenland is because it's a country that's very much on the front line of climate change. So I think the Philippines is thought to be the country most affected, but Greenland, is, you know, because of the ice mass, is affected in different ways. So the difficulties are sort of particular to this icy climate. So the melting ice makes it difficult for people to travel, to see friends and family. And because of that, the economic systems are changing very fast, too fast for people to keep up with. And it seems that what people report suffering from so all sorts of symptoms. Oh, also there are unpredictable storms. And so before that survey in 2019, almost all climate change studies tended to focus on the impact on the environment and wildlife, which is obviously that is the important thing. But this one was the first kind of big one that focused on the mental health of human beings. And what they found was that 90% of Greenlanders felt that they were witnessing the effects of climate change firsthand. And the knock-on effects of that seem to be increased levels of depression, anxiety, alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide. So yeah, really serious effects on human beings. And so the survey is really shocking to read. It's incredibly upsetting, but it's also, in a way, is not shocking if you're been working in that field, because people have been talking now for quite some time about their anxieties around the climate crisis. So very often people describe not being able to sleep because they're so haunted by images of ecological destruction, or maybe they just feel this overall sense of hopelessness about the future, or this thing of people in their 20s and 30s thinking they can't have babies. So if people read that we've only got 1 decade to turn things around, or maybe this other horrifying statistic, I don't know if it was in all the papers there a couple of years ago, but that there are 50 harvests left, and so that's probably down to about 48 or 47 by now, at the current rate of consumption. And it just, you know, when you read that stuff, it feels totally apocalyptic. And actually all those statistics were before we'd had a global pandemic. So it's as if, you know, there's really no hope for the future for lots of people, and it would just be cruel and irresponsible to bring new people into this world. So the question for, I don't know, therapists, counselors, psychoanalysts is how can you work with people who are suffering from the effects of that stuff when the problem is so big and so real? Because it's not like you can make any immediate difference to the problem, and you definitely can't tell people to calm down and get over it, although apparently there are lots of therapists who try to do exactly that. So you hear about therapists saying, well, don't worry, because, you know, in the UK it's not going to hit us, you know, it's happening over there, so just keep going as you are. They're sort of really irresponsible responses, but I think it's probably because the therapists are anxious too, and they just don't know what to say. But it seems that so the people who are extremely anxious are the people who are on the right track, the people who are sort of commensurate with reality, who can grasp what might be happening. And so it would be the people who are less anxious who you'd need to be more worried about, but maybe they're the ones who don't turn up in psychoanalysis necessarily. So part of the work in the therapy might be to help people convert anxiety into something else, something that they can kind of live with and tolerate, and to enable them to act rather than to prevent them from acting. So the idea is definitely never, ever, ever to try to talk people out of their fears. So just to break it down a little bit, there seem to be a few different ways that people experience the thing that gets called eco-anxiety. And there are lots of people who don't like that expression, who just think calling it anxiety pathologizes it, and it's a rational fear, so don't give it the name of an illness, which I agree with. But the thing that we've, I don't know, somehow agreed, at least in the Anglophone world, to call eco-anxiety might manifest itself as anxiety, or as grief, or sadness, or depression, or as a thing that's come to be called pre-traumatic stress, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also I would say as either guilt or denial, which seem to be two parts of one thing, that either you feel guilty or you're in denial. So to go through those a bit more slowly, one at a time. With anxiety, you have, a fear of what's happening and a sense of panic around it. And the thing about anxiety is that it can actually be energizing, I guess that's sort of what it's for. But also that energy can turn against you and stop you from sleeping and living. So the worst thing is to feel utterly powerless. So one of the best things you can do is to turn your anxiety into activism, or get involved with other anxious people to sort of collectivize, or do whatever you can to communicate it, to write blog posts or organize campaigns, or do stuff within your university or nationally or globally, depending on how ambitious you are, or get involved with campaigns that are already up and running. Then there's grief, which is in a way can function in the opposite way to anxiety. It can absolutely sort of demotivate you and prevent you from moving. So grief, depression, what used to be called melancholia, are all roughly in the same category, and the risk with those things is that that you feel that everything's been lost already, that the damage has already been done and there's nothing you can do. So that, in a way, is a perfectly, natural defense against psychic pain, and maybe it seems safer to get on with mourning, with accepting the loss, than with fighting against it, because the risk, if you try to fight, is that you might lose. So very often we'd see, in relation to other things, that people try to control the situation by either losing or giving up on purpose. And so we deal with that stuff all the time in kind of non-climate related psychoanalysis. So if someone feels they'll never be loved, then they'll never do anything to bring about being loved. So they've lost the love before they've even tried to gain it. And Freud wrote a fantastic essay about this idea of preemptive mourning, of giving up before it's happened. It's on transience in 1915, where he talks about precisely that stuff. And if you read it, it sounds like an account of climate grief. It's Rainer Maria Rilke and Lou Andreas Salome on a country walk with Freud, and they just can't enjoy the countryside because they know that it's all the plants are gonna die. But so then the next thing is this funny new idea, which has been christened pre-traumatic stress. And it's a kind of twist on the older idea of post-traumatic stress, where something, really terrible happens to someone and they can't recover from it. And so the trauma keeps coming back. But in the case of pre-traumatic stress, the traumatic event hasn't actually happened yet, but the person can see it coming and feels helpless to do anything about it. And of course, with regard to global heating, all sorts of things have already happened, but so here we'd be talking about the next possible set of consequences. So the really, societal breakdown, mass displacements of people, and even potentially wars. So this kind of mega catastrophe that we're perhaps only seeing the very, very small tip of at the moment. And so that term, pre-traumatic stress, was invented by a psychiatrist called Lies van Susteren to describe the effects on climate scientists who are seeing changes kind of unfold in the environment, maybe, marine biologists who are watching coral and they're just seeing what's happening and becoming ill because of it. So the loss of species, the melting of ice caps, the increase in wildfires, the soil erosion, all the people observing that stuff literally can't bear it. But they apparently would often feel unable to communicate what they were seeing to ordinary people. So in part, that would be sometimes because they were worried that they were wrong. And so the things that they might extrapolate or predict from their observations led to very kind of serious, alarming predictions about the future. And they basically didn't want to risk frightening people too much. But at the same time, if they didn't tell people what they were seeing, then they wouldn't be able to stop it happening. So the scientists started to experience a kind of madness, which is exactly the madness in the myth of Cassandra, the Greek myth. You know, she has the power to see into the future, but she's cursed. And the curse is that she can see the future, but no one's going to believe her. And so the scientists are have been in exactly that position. So there's a kind of counterintuitive idea for people experiencing that sort of thing, and you see it absolutely everywhere in the literature. But I first heard about it from an Australian GP whose patients come to her with climate worries, and she lives in a part of Australia where they experience really devastating wildfires. And the term she used that I had for the first time from her is functional denial. So when you really grasp the reality of climate change, it can be so horrifying, so enormous, that it risks stopping you getting on with life altogether. But so the thing is that if you're going to do anything about it, you kind of have to keep living, and maybe it's really important that you continue to find things to like about the world, that simple as to love your friends, your family, to experience joy, to find ways to be there for other people. And so this kind of denial is doesn't mean you buy a sports car and you start eating beef. It just means that you make sure you don't worry all the time, and so you find things to love about the world that can make that possible. And obviously it sounds really banal, it's a totally non-psychoanalytic idea, but it's kind of serious, and everybody who works in that field says exactly the same thing, that you have to find ways to not know in certain moments if you're going to be able to bear to engage with the subject. Then finally, this funny pairing of guilt and denial. So you could say with most people, it manifests more or less more strongly as one or the other, or that one sometimes leads to the other. And it's not a bad thing if people feel guilty, as long as it makes them do something different. But the problems come when people try to block guilt out of their minds. And so this would be, a sort of very old-fashioned Freudian thing. And going back to the last point too, this whole business of not knowing seems to be very, in a way, the human mind is structured to help us not to know the things we don't want to know. So, and psychoanalysis has traditionally been a discourse that says, no, you have to know it, you have to know it. But so with the climate thing, it's been slightly different, partly because people have been pathologized for such a long time and told that they're crazy and that, it's completely nuts to think that the world's going to be ending anytime soon and the apocalypse is coming, and those people would be treated probably as, low-level psychotics. But now that sort of how the question would be more, how can you help people to know those things? A bit like you used to be able to supposedly help people to know about their Oedipus complexes or whatever, but how you can make the unbearable or the unthinkable thinkable. So with the people who have this kind of manic defense, they maybe, they might feel guilty, but the guilt has to be repressed. So they would go, around taking unnecessary flights, buying nutty, cheap fashion, promoting damaging business practices, or just standing by the idea that climate change isn't happening and that people are just being hysterical. So with those people, it's generally not a good idea to shout at them or have a go at them. And maybe at the end when we discuss, it's, I don't know, there seem to be lots of different strategies around activism. And I don't know if Extinction Rebellion have much of a thing going on in Bosnia, I don't know. But here they started off very well and then suddenly did very badly and became very unpopular, to do with some stuff around whiteness and race and privilege and where one speaks from and where one protests from. So yeah, maybe we can discuss that at the end. But with the sort of classic climate denier, you could say that they just have very kind of robust psychic defenses. They look like they're coping really well, they're absolutely fine, but at some level they really can't tolerate what's happening, and they do actually know. And it's unbearable to think that the clothes that they wear, the car that they drive, the holidays they go on, the food they eat, etc., the entire fabric of their life is contributing to the crisis. So if you try to make people in that state of mind feel guilty, it's almost certainly not going to work. They'll be very sort of well internally defended against guilt. So they're going to see, you know, any activist's guilt trip coming and have plenty of internal resources for kind of pushing it away. So it seems it's much better to be kind of gentle with those people and try and coax them around, and to show them that it's in their best interest to acknowledge this kind of, I don't know, scientifically backed up reality. So it seems as people concerned with climate change, it's better to try to seduce people than to alienate them. And that might involve being very tolerant of people who are doing things that we find upsetting. So this whole business of sort of polarization and people shooting off in kind of wildly opposite political directions is not helpful to the climate crisis. And if there are ways to try to speak, then, you know, that's got to be a good thing. But XR seem to have got themselves in trouble by not taking a political stance, by, in a way, not being left-wing enough, and by saying that they'll look at any solution, and, you know, green capitalism is great. If they've got a good idea, then they can just come and tell us and we'll support them. And that maybe that actually, I don't know, that being too open to kind of big capitalist technological solutions isn't very clever, although the sort of proximity of the crisis is so huge that it looks like the only possibility is a combination of political change and technological change. And yeah, so maybe that's another thing we can talk about later. But it's funny, there's lots of stuff in the psychoanalytic literature that I think might be helpful to the subject, just about how you present people with things they don't want to know. And so in the sort of, I don't know, Hitchcockian representations of psychoanalysis, you always see the analyst just saying to someone like, you want to fuck your mom, or whatever it is. The horrible idea just gets kind of thrown at the person. And later analysts, and I think Freud himself was thought to be very tactful by his patients. He wasn't a sort of brutal analyzer. And so how you can put things, when you time things, how you intervene, whether they can be framed as a joke, etc., might be very important in how you speak about this stuff and how you bring about change. Then there's this question of whether, as a psychoanalyst, a therapist, a counsellor who's concerned about climate change, if someone comes to talk to you about it, are you there to make them feel better at all? And that's been another sort of, I don't know, century-long question for psychoanalysts, whether letting people sort of experience pain and see difficult things and, you know, contradictions and problems is better than helping to sort of calm them down and soothe them and tell them that things are going to be okay. So opening people up to pain and enabling them to tolerate psychic conflict might be better. So that would be another question for people working in this field. And I know that when I wrote the book about it, the publisher wanted it to be basically about how to do deep breathing and yoga to make yourself feel better when you're having a panic attack. And I just, you know, that might help a little bit occasionally, but it's, yeah, you just have to look much further at kind of, you know, global economics and systemic change and all that stuff. And if you're not thinking about that and you're just doing deep breathing, I don't see how that's going to help anyone very much at all. But well, maybe momentarily. So, but on the subject of all that stuff, that one of the papers that all the climate psychology people refer to is called is by Harold Searles, and it's from 1971, I think. And it must have been written in response to the first Earth Day in 1970, which was this kind of big American thing where people really started to notice that we were screwing up the planet. And it was in the light of this Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring, this book about how pesticides were killing bugs and sort of destroying diversity, and then that was going to cause problems for pollination, and so they did manage to stop the use of certain pollutants at the time, but it was just becoming apparent what sort of damage people were talking about and how far-reaching and serious that was going to be. So he just runs through some ideas in this very short paper, which I'm pretty sure you can find online. It's called Unconscious Processes in Relation to the Environmental Crisis. And it's lovely because it's like very old-fashioned psychoanalysis. It's not happy clappy kind of therapy stuff. And it's a really simple paper, but it's one of those surprisingly dense ones. And it's super prescient. Like, I don't know if you've read the Jem Bendell Deep Adaptation paper, but where someone just really goes there, really names the pain, names the horror, and it's very, very striking. So in a way, Harold Searles in 1970 is already starting to think about eco-anxiety, although there wasn't a term for it then. But actually, he's not particularly worried about whether or not human beings are suffering from it. He just actually wants to save the planet. If people are having a hard time, that's kind of secondary. But he does talk about forms of psychological suffering and defenses against suffering that get in the way of our capacity to do anything serious or useful about the destruction of the planet. So rather than thinking about how to respond to people suffering, he's much more concerned with how to understand why people are being so complacent. And he thinks that's the important role that psychoanalysts can play in the discussion. And I definitely agree with him. And I think that my book was written much too much with the idea of feeling better in mind to do with this sort of publishing imperative. So yeah, I don't actually think people should feel better either. But yeah, in order to get the other ideas in, you have to talk about that. But it actually seems much more helpful to think about why we so often tend to go against our own best interests. So Searles sees the destruction of the planet as something really perverse and purposeful, and sets off with three problems that he sees as being really difficult to overcome. So the first one, which is still very, very much the case, that environmentalists seem like pious killjoys, and that alienates people. It's like you're just there to stop everyone having their great fun. Secondly, this is a very old-fashioned psychoanalytic point, but he says that taking the environment seriously is a threat to genital primacy. And so so something like a car would be a symbol of genital mastery. It's this very sort of, I don't know, classic Freudian idea, and that's a really longed for state, this mastery that dates all the way back to our early lives and this kind of desperate wish for cohesion. So taking cars away from people hits them really, deep at a deep psychic level. It's something unbearable. It's more than you can see. It's more than a car. It's their whole relation to their body and the world and the environment. Thirdly, he thinks the other problem is that people have a hatred of Oedipal rivals, and by Oedipal rivals he basically means of all other people or of your peers. And so anyone who kind of competes with you for resources. But he makes a particular point of mentioning transgenerational conflict and adults feeling supplanted by children, and that basically the envy of the parent of the child who's going to come and fill their place and be alive once they're dead, etc. And so he speaks about adults basically poisoning the world for children so they can't come and supplant them. And he talks a lot about the kind of abominable disappointingness of contemporary life, and the feeling that our lives aren't really worth saving. And anyone who lives in, I don't know, sort of late capitalist society, I can't see how, anybody would not feel that way at least part of the time. So, and then there's the inconsistency of urban life. So, the idea that there are no kind of proper networks, which gives people a reduced capacity to deal with losses. So if you're really embedded in a social system and someone dies or some damage happens somewhere, you're much better equipped to deal with a loss than if you're dealing with it by yourself in a kind of atomized way. So he thinks we try to control losses by making sure we've got nothing to lose. And it's to do with a sort of omnipotent idea that it's better to destroy life than to lose it according to someone else's design or wish. So, and definitely it's almost like it's better to kill yourself than to lose your life to the inevitable processes of aging, whatever. So, and the other thing would be the dominancy of technology. So even in 1971, before smartphones and laptops and fucking talking on Zoom all day, he talks about being surrounded by stuff that's dead. So it's inanimate, but is also very sophisticated, and that just to tolerate being around that all the time, it registers at a psychic level that's not great. Also the fact that everything we eat, breathe or drink is basically going to kill us. It's an unfortunate aspect of contemporary life, even in the 70s. And then this other idea, which is, it's sort of, I don't know, particularly painful and maybe fascinating, but this, where to locate the good and the bad. And he's sort of saying, well, historically, maybe people located the bad in nature, and that technologies were there to save you from nature, because nature is cruel, it's going to destroy you. It's all of, I don't know, culture is a defense against it. But we've reached a tipping point where suddenly now it's technology that's going to get us, and we idealize nature as this lost thing that, and so we're stuck between those two impossibles, not knowing really how to, I don't know, inhabit our lives in the world we live in. And there's, sorry, nearly got to the end of this paper. I find it's a beautiful paper, and I think it's really, I don't know, it's much better than anything I could say about it. But another idea that I thought was great in it, he talks about ecological systems developing a tolerance to pollutants, but while they develop this tolerance to pollutants, so maybe, if you're always using a certain type of pesticide on a cornfield, then some bugs will die and some bugs will proliferate or whatever. But so in the process of ecosystems developing this tolerance, they lose their rich complexity and their stability. And Searle suggests that that could also be true of our psychic lives in a highly technologized world. That in a way we are, I don't know, submitted to kind of psychic simplifications. And I guess it is the sort of boomer idea that you might hear about people who spend all day on Instagram or whatever, that they don't develop the sort of, I don't know, psychological density of a 19th century literary character. That there's a sort of flatness that might develop with people who live all the time in that way. So, and to finish, just one more thing about his paper, but it's this whole question of whether we work to save the planet or whether the planet has become an instrument that is able to destroy us all. And if it's that, then the Earth is currently in a state that's perfect for triggering really primitive anxieties. So these sort of baby fears that people talk about in psychoanalysis that then have to be repressed and then have to appear as something else in later life, basically everything that causes you to dream and make jokes, that the planet is in a state to sort of cause you psychic pain in a really, really particular way, but also to tempt you to invest in your most omnipotent fantasies. And so the whole sort of Elon Musk, don't worry, we're going to invent a rocket that's going to get you out of here and we'll grow plants on it and it's all going to be cool, is that the temptation is to kind of think about that. But at the same time as that thought, I don't know, it seems sort of intolerable that people might like it, but they also might not like it, that what would be so great about that life. And I guess that, I don't know if you've seen the Pixar film Wall-E, but it's exactly about that. Anyway, so yeah, that's Harold Sells. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, if it's possible to get through this thing fast enough, but it's this question of whether to breed or not to breed. And I wanted to talk about it kind of non-psychoanalytically, and maybe more sort of socio-economically. But I think because it's difficult to keep open the question in a psychoanalytic practice. So, and one of the problems is that if people come to you and they say, I can't have a baby because the planet is, in the state it's in, if you try to expand the question a little bit and ask them a bit about what their relationship with their mum was like or what their experience of childhood was like, people might think you're a climate denying idiot who is trying to sort of pathologize them. Whereas, there's a massive reality which by asking those questions are sort of putting in doubt. So it's how to keep this question of whether to have a child open without being an idiot climate denier, which I think is really difficult to do. And the question seems to, it comes in these two mutually reinforcing parts. So there's the impact of the environmental impact of the child on the world, and then the impact of climate breakdown on the child. And if you put those two together, well, you can see that lots of people would decide not to do it. So now I'm going to talk just much more about the impacts of the child on the world. But I think there are lots of discussions online about how to talk to children about this sort of the horrible stuff that's going to go down potentially in their lifetimes. But it seems that this question of whether or not to have a baby turns out to be much sort of bigger and more difficult and more loaded than many of the other questions people might ask themselves about how to live or what they want from life. So, because embedded in that question are all sorts of other questions like, is life worth living at all? Is it reasonable to have any hope about the future? Even things like, if it turned out that you were going to be one of the, the last generation of humans on Earth, would you wish you hadn't been born? So while it might sort of appear to make logical sense not to reproduce because of all those sorts of questions, that doesn't mean that the idea doesn't resonate in a really sort of deep and painful way. So is it possible to sort of coolly concede that the world's no longer a viable human or animal habitat and just kind of get on with living out the rest of your life quietly and harmlessly and just, buy secondhand clothes and eat vegetables and hope you don't hurt anyone too much in the process? But it seems that it's not that easy to do that, or just to accept that's the state of things. But you often hear it presented by people in a kind of affectless way. They're just like, well, I'm not going to have a baby because why would you do that? It's terrible. So there are a few people who are kind of working in that zone. There are some activists in America who have founded an organization called Conceivable Future. And it's an American female-led collective. And they say that the fact that large numbers of people are asking those questions at all is already proof of the catastrophe that we're talking about. So in a sense, it doesn't matter whether you have a child or don't have a child. The fact that you're having to have that discussion in relation to societal breakdown and ecological breakdown is that's enormous. And so So they argue that, you know, individuals can make decisions however they want to make decisions about how they conduct their lives. But meanwhile, people in a position to legislate and make big sweeping changes need to be acting very urgently to de-escalate that situation. So, you know, whatever it is, governments need to be making rail travel cheaper, flying more expensive, legislating against wasteful packaging, challenging fossil fuel industry, stop subsidizing the meat industry, which is what they do in the UK and in America. So it should not be down to young couples to solve the climate crisis by not having children. That's not where to put the responsibility. So the sort of point in an organization like Conceivable Futures isn't to advise people on whether or not it's okay to have a baby, but it's to raise awareness around that distressing subject so governments feel more pressure to act. But in the UK, we've got this other thing, which I think has some global reach as well. I don't know, you can tell me, but it's a very much growing movement and it's a bit more strident, but supporters are not going to have any babies until governments can demonstrate that they're taking the crisis seriously. And so it's founded by a musician called Blythe Pepino. And there's been a terrible backlash against the movement. And so Pepino, the woman who set it up, gets trolled online by haters saying all the, I'm not even going to repeat it, but the usual misogynist threats and trying to sort of bully her into shutting up. So it's this sort of really toxic, heated subject. But the question of whether or not to have children obviously doesn't only impact on the feelings of a bunch of kind of affluent, highly educated, 30-something, you know, New Yorkers or Londoners or whatever. Reproduction is a really important factor in the shape and direction of an economy. So in spite of relative economic stability, birth rates in lots of developed countries are going down, although apparently America saw a really tiny increase of 0.09% in 2019, so really, really small, but that's after years of falling figures. And so the reasons for the falling figures are obviously, you know, really complex and varied. It's not because people are refusing to have babies because of climate change. But, you know, there are things like in lots of developed countries, it's becoming harder and harder for younger people to set themselves up in careers and in stable housing. And then there are other factors like sort of broader cultural shifts away from ideas around tradition and continuity and towards things like individual happiness. So there's not such an ideal of, you know, sort of giving yourself over to the raising of the future generation. It might be more emphasis on enjoying your own life. So, and also just technologically, if you're going to have a child, you're probably going to have to really want it, because getting pregnant by mistake is less and less of a thing. That's, and also all you ever seem to hear about, at least in my practice, is people trying to get, if they're going to have a baby at all, they want to get conception exactly right. So they make all these calculations around sort of probationary periods at work. If you've been employed for this many months, then you'll get maternity leave and, you know, blah, blah, blah. But it's as if their body is actually going to obey their employment contract or fit in around the demands of an employer. And it seems that's exactly the sort of idea around reproduction that our culture coerces us towards. But and maybe counterintuitively, but I'm sure you know that wealth and low birth rates often go together. So in countries with a high standard of living, good medicine, people might have fewer children, but expect much more for them. So they might want to have, you know, the best educations and the most fantastically interesting forms of work. So life becomes about a sort of connoisseurship rather than about survival. So life is this sort of luxury experience rather than a hard grind. And you live for yourself rather than for your family or your community. And it's exactly those sorts of societies with those ideals that are causing problems for the planet. So it's not poor people in, I don't know, Africa, who are supposedly, you know, overpopulating and spilling out all over the place. It's these careful, rich people with 1.87 children or whatever, you know, the national average is, who constantly sort of upgrade their iPhones and have really nice freezers and go on yoga retreats in India. Those are the people who are destroying the planet. And so when people say, which you can find on lots of websites in lots of places, the best thing you can do for the planet is to have one less baby. So I don't know how many imaginary babies people are going to have, but if you imagine one less, that's the best thing you can do with the planet. It's insane. But it matters a lot who that baby is born to. So an Indigenous Australian Aboriginal baby has a completely different carbon footprint from a middle-class British baby. So we have this guy who everyone loves in the UK, well, everyone-ish, but called David Attenborough. I don't know if has any international presence at all. He's a bit of a Netflix dude, I'm sure.
Yes, we follow him.
Yeah, he's like a national hero and everyone's dad or everyone's granddad, and everyone loves him. But he got himself into quite trouble over this question of overpopulation, saying that it was, you know, humanity's urgent responsibility to breed less. And, you know, the problem with that, apart from just being like a sort of boomer telling young people how to live, it doesn't take into account the sort of, I don't know, all sorts of other problems, like the really fraught topic of race and women's reproductive rights. So Attenborough couches this argument, which is a popular argument. It's not his argument, you see it all over the place, but he you know, sort of puts it in the terms of feminism, and he says, wherever women are given political control of their bodies, where they have the vote, education, appropriate medical facilities, and they can read and have rights and so on, the birth rate falls. There's no exceptions to that. And so for David Attenborough, apparently, that's sort of simply self-evident and good. So less people means less pollution. But so for him, it's sort of straightforward and numerical, and I'm sure he meant well. But actually, and you can find that argument in the UK. We just had Malala on the front cover of Vogue, and I know she's a great supporter of educating women. Obviously, educating women is a fantastic idea, but educating them in developing countries with the aim of reducing reproduction, with the aim of affecting climate change, is sort of ineffective method, because you're aiming at the wrong people. So there's a New York Times book called Drawdown, which puts that idea really at the top of important things people should be doing. So some of the problems with that are that it lands the problem of saving the planet on the shoulders of women in developing countries, because supposedly they're the ones who lack education and lack access to birth control. So, you know, by deduction, then educated women in wealthy, super consumerist societies can carry on guiltlessly having, you know, one child or maybe two children, although each of our babies will consume many, many times more than any of those sort of extra waste, you know, African babies that David Attenborough is trying to save us from. I wouldn't want to argue against educating women nor giving women equal rights. Those are a good idea. But the problem lies in the assumption that population control is the issue instead of the consumption habits of the members of any population. So in South Korea, where the jump to super developed country happened really, really fast, and the education of women leapt forward in a really short space of time. So the birth rate fell to below 1 to 0.98 in 2018. And that seems to be partly to do with all sorts of factors, but especially the high cost of education. But the carbon emissions in South Korea are currently around 11.85 tons per person. So that makes it the fifth highest polluters in the world. So the UK is 13th, but Australia, where I'm from, is second in the world, only after Saudi Arabia. So David Attenborough, along with all these other celebrities, was a patron of a charity called Population Matters, who were advocating contraception and education for women in developing countries. Alongside, they were also advocating tougher controls on migration. And actually, they were arguing apparently for zero net migration to the UK, which makes them even worse than our worst right-wing political parties. And so, you know, they very soon came under fire from Amnesty International for this suggested policy of keeping migrants out. And that, you know, they were including people like Syrian refugees fleeing war. Sorry, you can't come. But they also offered this really offensive scheme where people in rich countries could offset their carbon footprint by paying to send contraceptives to people in developing countries. And, you know, apparently to some people that could pass for a sort of charitable act, until you realize that, say, the average carbon footprint of a person, a Malian person, for example, is 0.06 tons of carbon per person per year, whereas the average American produces 17 tons of carbon per year. So it's 0.06 versus 17 tons. So even though the average birth rate in Mali is 6.25 kids per family, it's a lot of kids, as opposed to America's 2.1, or in Britain apparently it's 1.8, but still this entire Malian family with 6.25 kids would only produce around 0.5 tons of carbon, so half a ton of carbon for all those people, as opposed to 17 tons for one American. So in planetary terms, the Malians would definitely be better off paying the Americans or the British to stop having babies, although obviously, yeah, they don't have the money or the power to do that. But it's also just this whole idea that you know, the rich should carry on kind of tastefully breeding while the profligate poor need to kind of stop having sex and rein it in. It sort of backs up this stupid, simplistic, completely wrong idea that the Malians are poor in the first place because they're kind of breeding up their country, and we all know that shit. Yeah. So yeah, the suggestion that is like there is more than their local environment can sustain or whatever, rather than because of global capitalism. So without, you know, debt and exploitation, they'd be very well able to produce enough food to get along just fine with that exact number of children. But it's the unjust interrelation between poor nations and rich nations that causes trouble around resources. So, you know, all the stuff like water supplies might be redirected towards cash crops, which are then exported and fed to American cattle. And that only benefits wealthy landowners in those countries and not the local population. So yeah, I know those arguments are part of other sort of intersecting arguments, and I'm leaving a lot out, and I know it's kind of simplistic, but this is so just, I think I should stop soon, and I know this is quite a lot of stuff, but just to, I don't know, maybe I can put down my notes and just say very quickly, but there's all the other stuff to do with aging population. So it's as if, you know, that myth about overpopulation wasn't bad enough, but also when you get an aging population, then apparently you have to bring in migrants anyway to support the aging population, and then they end up, you know, having to work, pay taxes and do menial jobs to look after the rich people, but gradually maybe they, you know, get settled and housed and earn some money, and then statistics seem to show that then that first wave of migrants develop the reproductive habits of the local population. And so then you have to bring in a second wave of migrants. And that's very often when you might start to see these sort of horrible shifts towards, I don't know, right-wing political movements and, you know, ideas like the Great Displacement and all that stuff, because this the aging population has forced movements that have brought that about. So it's not because people have come to invade you, it's because you've needed those people and now you're upset that they're there. So maybe that's enough to say for now. But all of which is to say that, yeah, the kind of question about whether or not to have a child is, I think, very much an open one. And that's before you get into any psychoanalytic stuff about what it means for you personally.
Thank you, Anouchka. I have lots of things to say, and also explain a little bit the Bosnian context in terms of environmental pollution, etc., but also some questions, etc. So maybe I'll just kind of give a few heads. First of all, in terms of air pollution, we are amongst the top countries in the world, actually.
Right.
I think like we were 6th in the world maybe 5 years ago. I don't think we are much better now. So we're not far off from North Korea. And one of the problems why we have such high levels of pollution in Bosnia is directly related to the war. And in the sense that after the war, you didn't have you didn't have a lot of these old industries and industrial complexes have not been revitalized, have not gone through the processes of decarbonization or going clean, etc., or they stopped working and then they just buried the environmental waste into the ground, completely, polluting the land, etc. So we have catastrophic situation there in terms of these dilapidated, huge industrial complexes. But in terms of energy production and air pollution, that's because, caused not just by the war, but also really corrupt neoliberal privatization that we had after the war. This shift from socialism into capitalism, it was quite brutal and really open to all sorts of predators and the crudest logic of profit, both by international and local elites. So basically, we have this huge problem with air pollution and unclean air. And I think UNICEF has recently said that due to air pollution, 44,000 years of human life is lost per year in Bosnia. And it's a small country. So, with like 3 million people, so I don't know, 44,000, that means like, they didn't count it in terms of like the whole life, but how much of our actually life we all lose because of the per year. So it's really kind of dire and catastrophic, and there's been a lot of activism around that, but also a lot of activism around water and resisting privatization of water and the building of dams, these private dams on really beautiful rivers that Bosnia has and is quite famous for, because we are rich in those energy resources, both in terms of thermal energy, in terms of energy in general, whether it's water or based on coal, unfortunately. So there is a lot of really, huge environmental problems that are somehow also connected with the whole dominance of neoliberal regimes that are quite colonial in the case of Bosnia. So there is this collusion of the elites and the bodies that came after the war as a sort of like protectorate for Bosnia. So we are like a sort of semi-periphery, but we are in many senses really experiencing really like completely colonized, internally and externally, and self-colonized situation. So I understand all this.
Who are the companies, or who are the particular?
Well, you have all sorts of companies. What do you mean? Who are the people who are?
Yeah, sort of who came to do what in Bosnia?
No, when I say international elites, I mean like the kind of governance that we have with the Office of High Representative and IMF and World Bank and European Development Bank. And they really kind of messed up the situation to get together with local elites who are just kind of ethno-nationalists, and they just see the profit everywhere. And plunging basically social goods everywhere. I'm sorry. But anyway, so that's what I wanted to say. Here, the eco-anxiety is through the roof in the sense that you can actually physically feel it all the time. It's not just weather changes or here and there, but really like in the winter, you know, when you live in big cities and you're coughing because it's like you're, I don't know, in Beijing or, you know, the most polluted, I think Sarajevo and Tuzla sometimes are more, and Kako and Zanica, these cities are more polluted than the most polluted cities in the world. So you feel it physically, and there is a real, not just anxiety, but real fear. So that's a little bit about the contents, but we also understand all these colonial narratives going around that. So I wanted to see whether other people, I'm sorry that Amina left, and Damir is having problems with his internet probably because it's too hot. Before I start asking my questions, I want to see whether Mahir or Anna and Dino have some questions or interjections. All right.
Okay, I have a question. I don't know whether you remember the speech of Greta Thunberg. I think it was before Corona. Now we have before and after. You know, she has Asperger or something like that, and you see the frustration and anxiety in her face, and this is the frustration of young generation. I mean, I believe so because, you know, do you see the generation collision between, I don't know, old people and the generation of Greta Thunberg? I mean, you know, because I think that people from 70s doesn't have any worries regarding, they see the factories as their, you know, ways to get money, to get wages, not any pollutions. They do, I don't know, coal for heating their homes. So, you know, I see many young people that has the frustration. Do you have any sort of research that compares this?
Not statistics, so no, it would only be sort of, I don't know, what I hear about in my practice or what I read about, you know, wherever. So yeah, I don't have sort of good statistical analysis of that stuff, but it seems to be very much out there in the culture. And I think, yeah, I mean, even the expression "okay boomer," was that very, did it arrive in 2018 or 2019? But the idea that generation of people, the generation you see, the older generation you're referring to, literally cannot grasp the problems that young people face. And so, yeah, exactly, all the stuff around climate change, but also the economic stuff, the fact that you can't just get yourself on the first step because, you know, employment is so difficult, property is so difficult that people just are excluded from all this stuff, that young people are kind of you know, held back by the older generation because they've got all the wealth and they've got all the power and they've got all the stuff, and then they say stupid things to young people about, oh, you know, what, stop fussing, stop eating avocados and, you know, get a proper job, or whatever it is, this sort of patronizing attitude of older people towards younger people, and the absolute apathy that Greta Thunberg seemed to be. It's the Davos thing you're talking about, isn't it, where she says, I want you to panic.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And just that she's speaking to these people who are just pathetic and who are really good at pretending to respond and really good at pretending to listen and to inviting her and just not doing anything about it.
Precisely. I mean, I see the reaction of these men and women, like, you know, I don't know how to explain that, but I see the fake thing and the collision in progress. I mean, in one point the generation will see the fake thing behind this.
Yeah, exactly. And the rage, people, it's so shocking. But the thing that is spooky, in that Harold Searle's paper from the 70s, he's talking about that already. He's saying that old people are terrible, that they envy young people and they don't help young people, and all this sentimental rubbish that older people say about, oh, we want to, do this for our children and, protect things for our children. They don't, because that's not what's happening. If that's what older people wanted, then that's what they'd actually do, but they don't. So yeah.
And I would like to, I don't know, this is a bit confusing. David Attenborough was a guest in royal family, and I mean he gave as a gift some, I don't know, ancient artifact, I mean from some fossil. And if you are so, I don't know, worried about something, why you act like this? And I don't know, the number of children in royal family also, I mean, I don't know. But I mean, we are talking about that right now. I don't know. Do you have any comments regarding that? I mean, I don't want to be impolite, but I see many flaws in many oppositions in his behavior.
Yeah, exactly. But it's crazy, isn't it? Because he's so institutionalized. He can say, oh, this is terrible, it's terrible what's happening to these insect habitats or whatever, but at the same time he's part of this sort of infrastructure, and there are lots of things that he's completely blind to, like thinking it's a good idea to pay people in Africa not to have babies. It's completely insane. Yeah. Like there's a lot that guy just cannot grasp, and just saying that we have to save bees is not really scratching the surface of it. But I think that
there's been like this period of the 90s and 2000s when Europe really thought somehow this whole idea of ethical foreign policy, Europe of the social justice and almost convinced people that somehow Europe has done away with its colonial take on the world, which was completely wrong, actually. It never stopped, and it is showing its ugly face, even more so, the whole kind of colonial side of Eurocentric politics everywhere. And I really think that many of these elites that were so cosmopolitan and believed that it would be somehow progressing towards the end of history and things are changing for the better. The 90s in general, before the kind of whole slump in the 21st century happened, they're still somehow locked in this idea that somehow Europe has overcome, or European countries have overcome these deeply problematic practices. But the thing is that are now returning inside through all sorts of things like Black Lives Matter, and then Brexit. It is very difficult to talk about this complicity of various structures and institutions in the situation that we have today. But actually that brings me to the question that I have about, I think, two things that you were mentioning: guilt and denial, and the dynamics between guilt and denial. And it seems to me that the third usual element added to guilt and denial in the language of law is responsibility. Right. Because when you talk, for instance, about criminal law or international criminal law, and you talk about, which I'm quite familiar with because of the whole war crimes thing and situation, and especially sexual war crimes in Bosnia and the post-war sexual violence connected. in a way interrelated. But anyway, so it seems to me like guilt, denial, but there is always this third thing. When you talk about guilt and denial, what gets mystified or obfuscated is responsibility. And that is the key, like, because ultimately, at least in the political sphere, in terms of eco-anxiety, if you feel guilt or shame and then denial, the key question is who is responsible then for for where we are and where we are heading. So it is not like in the case of war crimes, you have the past is at stake usually, but also the future. But you're talking about the past. Here, you're also talking about the past. Something happened in the past. Someone is responsible for things as they are. But again, even if we are talking, if we make that parallel between war crimes and eco crimes, then the future is at stake, because in the case of ecological crimes, even more so. But it seems to me that what I'm worried about when we talk about psychoactivism is, are we political enough? Are we actually collectivizing this problem of responsibility and actually addressing the problem in the right way? Basically, speaking truth to power, or really resisting something that is causing this problem. Because I don't think that these little gestures are, they're obviously not helping us enough. So but I think that psychoactivism is very important if at the same time you have a sound political platform to kind of join with. So that's why I looked at the conceivable future that you recommended, and I found that quite interesting. But I wanted also to ask you, in your own practice, how people talk about this political violence. How do they connect it to political violence or the politics of atrocity? And when we talk about atrocity can be man-made, and it can be caused by all sorts of catastrophes.
Yeah, so I wonder, the thing maybe that I've sort of seen the most firsthand, it's not so much in the clinic, but this really weird thing that I've been involved with, when you supposedly have this fantastic opportunity to speak to people who supposedly have some power. And so you get invited to speak in private, it'll be on Zoom, but with another activist. So in my case, it's a man from Greenpeace. And so we supposedly get this fantastic opportunity to speak to the heads of companies and to talk about their own eco-anxiety, because it's taken as read that they are suffering individuals who have this knowledge and they know where things are going, but they also supposedly have power because they, manage the funds of an insurance company or a pension fund or something. And so, it's supposedly for activists, it's this great thing that you're going to speak to people who have power. They're also suffering. You're going to be able to negotiate something brilliant with them. And what you find when you get there is that nobody has power, obviously, that that every single person in that room is going to say it's not them who has the power, that the power is elsewhere, that you can never ever locate it. And it's just ridiculous to think that you can have any sort of direct discussion around that stuff. And also that there are all these practices that are just amazing, and that the only good thing I think that activists can do is at least have names for them, because they're these invisible things like it's called predatory hesitation. And so it would be exactly to a business practice where you basically you are going to do the right thing, but you're just going to have a little zone before you do the right thing where you extract as much as you can, where you profit as much as you can, and then you change something. And so, yeah, I think that there is maybe some
mileage. That's a great term. I love it. Predatory hesitation.
Is really good, isn't it? Yeah, and so for me, there are things like, if you can go to those people and at least name those practices, because they might think that's so discreet that nobody knows they do it, because it's like taking a pause for breath, but actually in that pause for breath you do a lot of harm. But so I suppose if everybody can be really on that stuff, can be very observant, can name it, can confront it, can have something to say about it, maybe, you know, there are spaces like that where you might be able to do something, but it's so, the idea of addressing power just seems like it almost isn't a thing. Like there is no such thing as power. It's so diffuse.
No, I know, but in terms of how much you actually need today, in terms of the psychic energy and that you need, and also resilience that you need personally to be a part of the collective effort that is actually waging quite difficult battles, etc., that actually have this huge personal, emotional, mental toll on activists, etc., and really often splintered the movement because of very strange ways in which affect works, especially the affect that actually has an effect, this politics of affect that basically can implode the movement or some sort of initiative or strategy of group from within. So I was thinking, like we have predatory hesitation. I think we need to name also things inside properly, like almost like self-analysis as we go along, in order not to we have really really difficult experiences of how certain difficult episodes in activism affected us both personally and collectively, etc. And we talked a lot about this politics of affect and all sorts of things that happen horizontally between activists. So I was wondering whether you noticed any sort of interesting discussion on those on those matters in these eco-activist circles that you've been in touch with, like this. How do they replenish themselves, actually, their energies from within? Because when you're actually going through such levels of eco-anxiety and eco-fear and all sorts of other, you have to sustain yourself also to be active.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the only thing I suppose I see is that people really accept that is a real thing. And so there are all these organizations, I don't know, here we've got something called the Climate Psychology Alliance, and they're just people who will try to address that reality and try to create spaces for discussion around that kind of affect. And so I think they organize things called climate cafes and stuff, just where you can register subjective distress and where you can make that a social thing, where you don't have to be alienated by your distress, but that can be, I don't know, collectivized somehow, because exactly that's what's real. If you're all sort of on your own in your house thinking that the end of the world is coming, then it is. But
because what really makes me a little bit anxious, not really anxious, but I'm not that comfortable with the idea that guilt is enough as a motivator for this pro-environmental change, environmental change and behavioral. Guilt is a very tricky thing, and if we use it as a sort of like motivation, as like Greta Thunberg case illustrates, what does that do? And what are obviously there are some uses to that, but there are also limits to that. Like how politically effective guilt is when you mobilize it, and whether it's enough. What else you need to mobilize in terms of these things that make people move, basically, and act and be passionate about things. Exactly.
No, I completely agree. And I hope it was clear when I was speaking exactly that I don't think those movements think that guilt is particularly useful to anyone, exactly because of the human being's capacity for internal defenses against guilt. That in a way, if a human being is, well socialized human being is someone who's got really good internal defenses against Oedipal guilt, against their aggressive urges. That's sort of what it is to become human and be able to live in a society, is to be able to repress that knowledge about yourself. Yes. Mobilizing people's guilt, isn't that good? But I like the Lacanian idea in a way, that anxiety is the only affect that doesn't lie. And I think that anxiety maybe you can mobilize, but guilt maybe you can't. Yeah.
I think so. I actually completely agree. Anxiety is definitely the most authentic political emotion. But also subjective, as Lacanians would say, it's the only authentic, the only real emotion. There is no lying in it.
Yeah, exactly.
And there is no fantasy. There's much fantasy about.
Yeah. And it's a push
as an emotion. Yeah. So. So. Yes. Okay. I once read this article that claimed that those who actually feel this, feel responsible for nature, or feel upset about things that are happening, are usually the people who tend to anthropomorphize nature more than the others. There was some, sociological study, and they were comparing these levels. So people who understand nature in an anthropomorphic way, as a human being, almost in a sense, they also have much greater capacity to be somehow mobilized around the harm that is being done to nature. So what do you think about that? Is that something that we should actually, maybe we should push people to understand, to more anthropomorphize nature.
That sounds exactly like a
because
really good idea.
Then the harm done to it somehow affects us more, because it's part of us. Then you feel as one with it. So it's really interesting. I found it okay.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, I think it's really good. I don't want to go down a Lacanian vortex, but I suppose in relation to this sort of real, symbolic, imaginary thing, in a way, what can you do about the real? If nature on some level could be conceived as the real, it's just disruptive, it's destructive, you can't speak about it, it's sublime, it's, but if you have this kind of fantasy overlay, this imaginary thing, then you can develop a relationship with it, maybe, rather than just be flooded by it or attacked by it or destroyed by it. It's something that you can have build a different relationship with. And even if it is a fantasy relationship that relies on a bit of sort of hopefulness, and it's a bit delusional.
Well, maybe only if we do that kind of symbolic work, the harm done to it becomes more visible to more people, and not just more visible, but also more it's something that is not acceptable, more unacceptable.
Yes.
I don't know. So I don't know. I know that if you start anthropomorphizing nature, you can go down the Lacanian, all sorts of holes in the Lacanian universe, but especially when we start, but also you can do it in different ways, just thinking about life in terms of like vegetality, and critical life studies and sciences are really interesting, that blur these boundaries that we have between humans and other living beings, whether animals or plants, etc. Not just Haraway, but also other critical life sciences, and so forth. So interesting stuff. Thank you. I want to see whether anyone else wants to. I think I overused the time as a host. Emina, Anna, Mahir said that he's fine. He's just listening. And any questions or comments?
I think that it was a very interesting lecture. I'm sorry, can you hear me? I'm out with my dog.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that your lecture, it kind of reminded me of the movie The Happening. I don't know if you have seen it.
Oh no, I'll watch it. Hang on, I'll write it down.
It's when how should I explain it? Plants turn against humans. And due to everything that we have done to nature and the environment and to ourselves, basically, as the wind blows, plants create a toxin that actually makes humans kill themselves. But I mean, it is a horror movie, but it does show how, I mean, if nature could fight back, this is the way it would fight back.
Yes. Yeah, I wonder, well, yeah, I'm going to watch it. It sounds really good. But I wondered, yeah, what you might think, or anyone here might think of things like, you know, the voluntary human extinction movement, people who think that human beings are so sort of, I don't know, such degenerates that the best we can hope for is to become extinct so all the other, you know, the plants can take over. And whether, I don't know, that's an idea that one can live with, or whether people continue to think that there's some mileage in, I don't know, the continued existence of humanity, because that seems to be one of the, you know, the big questions that comes up in the ecological movement, whether or not, you know, human beings are okay. And for some reason, I keep coming down on the side of human beings. But I meet a lot of people who don't, and I know that, yeah, it's possible to take their opinion seriously.
Well, we can see that. I mean, we saw that when the pandemic started. I was in Spain, and there was a complete lockdown, as I mean, UK as well.
Yeah. I heard Spain heavy.
The most interesting thing was that because everybody was inside, all of a sudden birds were flying. I don't know, animals were out, 10 cats were in front of my door. That's just a silly example. Yeah. But it did seem that nature flourished due to the fact that humans weren't around.
Yeah.
And that's just my comment.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And again, thank you for your lecture.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I have just an observation regarding baby issue. I mean, the number of babies and everything. You already mentioned that the Europe is old continent, and we have the China example that shows us that you know, any, I don't know, planned population politic will, you know, strike you back. So I think that we cannot, you know, do David Attenborough thing, or, you know, you said it really well, you know, people should decide by themselves. I mean, I don't know. I don't have. I just see in history that the planning on you know, wide level isn't a solution.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. The idea that there's some social design that could save the planet is really. I mean, I suppose that, yeah, it's amazing that there are all these bad solutions out there, like the, you know, the Elon Musk type solution is a terrible solution. The social engineering, David Attenborough one, terrible solution. I don't know, it's very difficult, but then what is a good solution?
And I don't know what's with men, because they keep digging in our, you know, tummies, in female tummies all the time. You know, they have some sort of need, I don't know, urge to control female, you know, choice, so female choice.
But I also find it very, I find it completely unacceptable, and when you have suddenly this talk about reproductive justice coming from the most developed countries in the world, because it seems to me that it's often basically that it's often blind to the fact of how it is also about condemning the poor and condemning the countries that are less developed, etc. And that this is often full of meta-racism, and that it's kind of not only that it's condemning people in racial but also in class terms as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think the talk about reproductive justice to me is only sound when it has this kind of truly post-colonial perspective that is also at the same time very intersectional and takes these issues of race, gender, class together, and also different. Usually, it's the discussion about reproductive justice is much better and much more sound in countries like China or India or Latin America or then I don't know, then from, I don't know if it's coming from Hollywood or something like that. Yeah. But with the whole Me Too movement, there is a danger that somehow women's voice is equated with the voice of women from a highly privileged industry. And there is that, or professionally really in advantageous position. So there is that as well. But I don't know about Bosnia in terms of like what I think there is this deep I think around us there is this deep disaffection since the 90s horrors, and has never really left us. And basically the situation in society is like, it's okay as long as it's not the war, etc. So this kind of gives it a dimension that you don't have much belief in humanity if basically you're just somehow for you that's the constant 0 point, like in the war situation, and where basically you have this huge loss of human lives. And now we have huge exodus of people as well. People in the best years of their lives are going as labor force, usually to German-speaking countries, because this is the migrant labor that they need, and it's kind of highly skilled and also European looking, so it's more easily assimilated. But basically in the last five years we had hundreds of thousands of people leaving. So so this sense of loss of human life in Bosnia is happening along different kind of trajectory, and I don't think that people are that much thinking about overpopulation of the world as they're thinking about this huge environmental crisis that we have at the moment. At the same time, depeopling of the country of the most progressive political and agents potentially, or a labor force necessary for a sound running country. So there's a lot of bleakness around that. But I think so I can't say really what people would say about I mean, but they would agree that there is nothing worse than human being, as Mark Twain would say. When he was asked about identity, I don't know whether, and he said something about identity. So I don't care if a man is black or white, this or that. I don't know what he was mentioning. It's enough for me to know that he's a human being. He can't be anything worse. So that kind of sentiment is, I think, dominant in Bosnia. That we are the worst of the worst as human beings. So with that there is a parallel. So.
And do you have in Bosnia this thing that, what is it, this sort of deactivation of activism, that the forces that work against activism are really, really potent? Because in the UK it's been very strange to see how there was this huge surge of environmental activism in 2018 and it just got killed by
it got killed by who?
Well, it's amazing, by different forces, and it was so hard, when you try to see sort of whose interest does it serve, You just couldn't tell. And so there were a few different things that happened simultaneously, and some of them made sense. But so one of the big ones was with XR. They did this huge event in London, and they stopped the traffic, and that went really well, and everybody was like, yes, there's a crisis, this is real, and so then they did the same thing again a few months later. I think that one was at the beginning of spring. So then at the beginning of autumn, they do the same thing again, and it's a catastrophe, and they stop the tubes. Everyone hates them because everyone's trying to go to work, and they're like, why would you disrupt us going to work, whatever. And then this thing about race came up in a really big way, and it's exactly the intergenerational thing too, because one of the big strategies of XR was that old people would get arrested, and that it would clog up the justice system, because if you're whatever in your 70s, then who cares if you've got a criminal record. But the problem with sort of being voluntarily arrested is that it only worked for white people. But if you're a black person, why would you trust the police to treat you properly in custody? And so it was seen as a sort of enactment of white privilege to go and get yourself arrested. And so then both sides started to hate the activists. The left hated the activists, the anti-racists hated the activists, and the right hated them too, because everybody hated them. And so that was a deadlock. Then there was sort of almost nothing you could do from there.
I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know about this kind of backlash that had happened in such a way from different sides. It went under my radar, but it's really interesting, because I think that somehow there is this level of brutality on the side of all the forces who you would think should actually build coalitions, but they actually are punishing each other. It's the same here. They basically start punishing each other for the mistakes, or etc. And on the other group. So when you say, okay, I understand the right wing against it, but the left wing, and you mentioned also the who else did you mention? The left hated them, the anti-racist, So and actually, I think there is a similarity here, in the sense that often these progressive forces would turn against you and join the actual enemy, or because they have some other grievances, but punish you. But there is a huge level of brutality inside all these different movements at the moment, and I don't know.
That's the same way you are.
What the situation is out of it, but it's really difficult to build coalitions. Across.
So that's exactly the same here. Yeah, it was absolutely a class thing too, because when they stopped, they did a protest on the underground, on the trains, and so it was all the people who can't afford a car to get to work, all traveling to work on the train. And they had the boss who was going to get upset with them if they were late. So it was like, you horrible posh people are stopping the workers from getting to work. It was just everyone was down on these protesters, which for reasons that were really understandable, that made sense. But it just meant the whole thing kind of disappeared.
I'm actually sorry that this year we are having all these master classes online, and I am only hoping that next year we can actually put all our master classes in cluster, because I'm now thinking how great it would be that we had we could host few of you together and have like discussions and roundtables, because I'm just comparing this kind of setup we were forced to adopt because of the pandemics, compared to our usual summer seminars, whether they were psychoanalytic or more open-ended, etc. And because this year we had you, Nina, and there's going to be Kirsten Campbell from Goldsmiths, and we'll have Samo Tomšić also from Berlin speaking. So maybe next year we do something. I'm hoping that we do master classes in real life, and that it's kind of all squeezed into 5 days or 3 days, 4 days, so that we are all there in the same room or in the same spots, and we can have all these interesting discussions in breaks and all sorts of other things and get familiar with it. So I am really hoping that we host you in Bosnia at some point.
That would be wonderful. I love it. And
I'll get in touch when I'm in London, and I hope that I'll be by the end of this year, hopefully, but definitely in the next academic year, because that's how we found time. There's a us in the academia. And thank you so much for this, for joining and giving masterclass. I only have a question whether it would be okay for you if we, because we recorded this session, if we would maybe make at least the first part of your lecture available online for our members, but we'll send you, once we do the video, we'll send it to you for approval, etc.
It's fine.
Because we would like more people to hear about this.
Yeah, well, I would never be able to bear to watch it, so I can just okay it now, because
yes, okay. Yes, I can't watch it. I can't watch myself either. So I usually decide on the spot, yes or no.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks.
Totally fine. You can do it.
I understand. Thank you so much, Anouchka.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.